two fathers, two homes, two smiles that hid something almost identical beneath. Chris Watts in Colorado, Chris Coleman in Illinois. Both built the image of a perfect husband, a loving father, a stable provider. Each filmed family moments, birthdays, holidays, vacations, portraits of normal life. And then, each destroyed that life completely. What drives a man to kill his own family? Is it rage, jealousy, a moment of panic, or something deeper, a fracture inside the mind that turns love into ownership and image into obsession? Today, we step into the psychology of control, ego, and moral collapse, to uncover why two men with everything still felt the need to destroy it all. This isn't about crime alone. It's about identity, and what happens when the self a man shows the world isn't the self he lives with inside. At first glance, Chris Watts and Chris Coleman couldn't seem more different. Watts was a mechanic in the Colorado suburbs, quiet, unassuming, humble. Coleman was a professional bodyguard for a famous Christian minister, living in a beautiful home outside St. Louis. Different jobs, different lifestyles, but the same illusion. Both were praised as devoted husbands. Both appeared deeply involved with their children. Both were surrounded by friends who believed nothing was wrong. And both felt trapped inside the lives they had built. Psychologists call this identity strain, the tension between who someone is and who they pretend to be. When that gap widens too far, it creates pressure that must escape somehow through fantasy, affairs, lies, or violence. Chris Watts was a man of few words who seemed compliant, even passive. But underneath, he resented his wife's dominant personality and the attention she received online. He felt small in his own house, not in control, not adored. And when he met another woman, a simpler version of life appeared within reach. He wanted freedom without conflict, a fresh start without consequences. That impossible fantasy became his motive. Chris Coleman lived a different illusion. He was the protector of faith security chief for a global ministry, married to his pastor's daughter. To the public, he was an example of moral strength. But behind that image was a man who despised the very life he was pretending to embody. He had an affair, too, with a childhood friend and wanted to leave his wife. Yet divorce would cost him his career, his church, and his public identity. So he decided his only way out was to erase the problem entirely. That's the pattern that links them: self-image fragility. Each man built a persona so fragile that any threat to it felt like annihilation. When their wives challenged them with truth, with boundaries, with independence, the illusion shattered. And instead of facing failure, they chose to destroy everything that reflected it. Family annihilators often follow this psychological sequence: a narcissistic self-image that depends on external validation, a trigger affair, financial pressure, loss of status, a fantasy of erasing the problem by removing those closest to them. Watts and Coleman fit every step. Watts spent weeks researching his mistress's interests, constructing a new version of himself to fit her dreams. Coleman sent fake threat emails to himself and his family to create a future alibi. Both were already writing the scripts of their crimes long before they acted, and yet both still smiled for family photos. Both still played the loving husband for social media. That mask was the only thing they believed made them valuable. To a narcissistic personality, the family isn't a source of love, it's a mirror. As long as the reflection looks perfect, everything feels safe. But the moment the mirror cracks, when a spouse challenges them, or a relationship exposes their insecurities, panic sets in. Parentheses, Chris Watts told investigators later that he felt like something just snapped in one moment. It eroded over months of self-hatred and denial. Chris Coleman spoke with police hours after his crime, calmly suggesting someone else must have done it, a total dissociation from reality. Both were already living in fantasy worlds of their own making. Psychologically, these two men represent different versions of the same disorder. Watts shows the covert narcissist, quiet, withdrawn, appearing humble, but secretly craving control and admiration. Coleman embodies the grandiose narcissist, loud, performative, driven by image and status. Both personalities collapse when the external validation disappears. Their stories force a single question. When a man builds his worth entirely on how he's seen by others, what happens when no one believes the image anymore? That's where their murders begin, not with violence itself, but with a silent fear of being exposed as ordinary. And in that fear, both Chris Watts and Chris Coleman decided they would rather erase their families than face their own reflection. Both men knew how to play the role. Chris Watts and Chris Coleman weren't just husbands. They were performers, living inside a self-made show about what a perfect family should look like. To the outside world, each image was flawless. Smiling photos, family vacations, church gatherings, barbecues with neighbors. Everything looked right, and that's exactly how they wanted it. Because for men like them, image wasn't decoration, it was survival. Chris Watts was the quiet one, soft-spoken, agreeable, patient. He didn't argue much, didn't push back, didn't raise his voice. To everyone around him, he looked like the dream husband, the kind of man who'd do anything for his wife and kids. But beneath that calm exterior was deep resentment. He felt overshadowed by Shanann's personality, her ambition, her energy, her online presence. She was confident. He wasn't. She took charge. He followed. And over time, that dynamic became a wound he never admitted existed. When he met Nicole Kessinger, the woman who would later become his affair partner, she saw him differently. She made him feel strong, independent, desired. That attention was addictive. He began to live a double life, the responsible father by day and the free man by night. The mask he wore for his family became heavier each week. He told himself he was just waiting for the right moment to leave. But he also knew leaving meant explaining himself, facing conflict, admitting failure. And that was something his fragile ego couldn't tolerate. So instead, he built a fantasy world where he could be both the good man and the free man. The problem is, fantasies collapse the moment they touch reality. When Shanann returned home that final night, reality came knocking. Chris Coleman's mask was louder, more polished, but just as hollow. He wasn't just a family man. He was a man of God, the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of America's most influential Christian organizations. His job required trust, loyalty, moral example, and he loved the attention that came with it. At church events, he stood tall, confident, strong, protective. He quoted scripture. He spoke about faith, discipline, and service. People admired him. But admiration can be a dangerous drug. Behind closed doors, Coleman's marriage was falling apart. He'd begun an affair with an old friend, Tara Lintz, and promised to leave his wife, Sherry, once the timing was right. He just didn't want to lose his career, his home, or his reputation in the process. So he invented a villain, fake threat emails, sent to his own family, warning that someone wanted them dead because of his work at the ministry. He used his computer at home to write them. He created the illusion of danger to cover the danger he was becoming. Every fake email, every phone call, every police report was part of his performance, a shield to protect the image while he prepared for its destruction. In psychological terms, both men displayed what experts call compartmentalization. It's the ability to divide life into separate boxes, one for love, one for lies, one for guilt, and keep them from touching each other. It's how sociopaths and narcissists maintain balance while living double lives. But there's a catch. Maintaining that balance drains energy. Eventually, the walls between those compartments begin to crumble. When that happens, the mask doesn't just slip, it shatters. Watts's co-workers later said that in the weeks before the murders, he seemed distant, distracted, almost euphoric. He was losing weight, working out more, acting like a man preparing for something not grief, but liberation. Coleman behaved the same way. He shopped for jewelry for his mistress, promised her a new life, and continued sending himself threats, as if rehearsing his own tragedy. Each man believed he could control perception until the very end. They underestimated how fragile their web of lies truly was. What makes these masks so dangerous isn't just the deception, it's the self-deception. They weren't only lying to others, they were lying to themselves. Both believed they were good men trapped by circumstance. Watts convinced himself that Shanann's dominance forced him to act. Coleman convinced himself that God would forgive him because his intentions were pure. They each needed to believe they were the victim, because admitting otherwise would destroy the fragile identity they'd built. To them, accountability wasn't an option. Control was. That's why the mask didn't come off when the murders happened, it came off after. Watts stood in front of TV cameras, pleading for his family's safe return. He spoke with rehearsed emotion, swaying side to side, eyes avoiding the camera. But his words didn't match his face, and the public noticed. Coleman cried to police about his wife and son's deaths, insisting that the threats were real. He even invited officers to inspect the letters he'd written himself. The performance continued, but this time, the stage lights were too bright. When detectives reviewed footage and timelines, both stories fell apart. Because no matter how perfect the mask, truth has a way of bleeding through. To psychologists, this phase of self-delusion is called cognitive dissonance collapse. It's the breaking point when a person can no longer reconcile who they believe they are with what they've done. For Watts, that collapse came during his polygraph test, when the weight of contradiction finally broke him. For Coleman, it came when investigators matched his computer to the anonymous threat emails. Their masks were gone, but they still clung to the illusion until the very last moment. Even in confession, each man tried to shape his own narrative. Watts claimed he killed Shanann in a moment of passion. Coleman claimed he blacked out and didn't remember. Both were still performing, rewriting their crimes, to protect the fragments of ego that remained. These masks, these carefully built illusions, are not unique to them. They are the same masks worn by every family annihilator, the false self, polished for approval, rotting underneath. And when it finally breaks, the person underneath often doesn't survive either. In the end, Watts and Coleman didn't kill because they stopped loving their families. They killed because they never truly loved themselves without the image. The mask was their life, and when it cracked, They destroyed everything it reflected. Control, it's the quiet thread running through every act of destruction committed by these two men. For both Chris Watts and Chris Coleman, control wasn't a preference. It was a requirement. They needed to dominate, not through power or violence at first, but through perception. The people around them had to see them as good, as successful, as in control. Psychologists call this narcissistic regulation, when someone's self-worth depends entirely on external validation. It's not about love or success. It's about the illusion of stability that others provide. As long as the world believes the image, they can believe it too. From the beginning, both men used control as a shield against fear. Chris Watts controlled by avoidance, staying quiet, staying agreeable, staying small. He never argued because argument meant exposure. He avoided confrontation because he feared conflict might reveal who he truly was: insecure, lost, and resentful. By acting calm, he controlled his environment. Chris Coleman controlled in the opposite way through dominance and authority. He projected strength, faith, and discipline. He liked people to see him as confident, reliable, masculine. He spoke in absolutes about right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, yet he betrayed every value he claimed to live by. For him, control was not silence, but performance. Both men built their lives around what others thought of them. And when their wives began to challenge those perceptions, the balance shattered. For Chris Watts, control started slipping when Shanann became more outspoken. Her social media posts showed a woman full of energy and independence, while he appeared as a quiet figure in the background. He smiled for her videos, but inside, he felt erased. His affair wasn't just about passion, it was about reclaiming the feeling of control he thought he'd lost at home. Nicole Kessinger represented the version of himself he wanted to be: admired, wanted, decisive. He started working out, dressing differently, changing his routine. The new identity made him feel powerful again, like the man he believed he should have been all along. Control, in his mind, meant escape. And when that escape seemed impossible without consequences, he looked for the most final way out. Chris Coleman, on the other hand, never appeared powerless. He was physically strong, financially comfortable, respected in his community. But his control was built on lies, a fragile stage that could collapse with one confession. He couldn't admit to his affair. He couldn't face public humiliation. He couldn't imagine living as the man who failed his church and lost his job. So, like Watts, he decided to control the only thing he could: the narrative. In psychological terms, both men fall under what experts call pathological control orientation. It's a mindset where losing power feels like death itself. To them, vulnerability is weakness, and weakness must be eliminated, even if that means eliminating the people who remind them of it. Family annihilators often see their families not as loved ones, but as extensions of themselves. The wife becomes the mirror of success. The children become symbols of purpose. When that reflection threatens to change through rejection, exposure, or loss, it feels like personal extinction. And instead of accepting that change, they destroy the reflection. Chris Watts told investigators that Shanann had been controlling and that he felt smothered. But in reality, she wasn't controlling. She was organized, assertive, ambitious. He just couldn't stand the feeling of being secondary. Coleman told detectives his wife was driving him crazy with suspicion and jealousy. But it was his own guilt that turned her questions into accusations. In both men, what began as emotional discomfort grew into psychological warfare. A war they couldn't win without eliminating the opponent. Control also explains their chilling calm after the crimes. When Chris Watts stood before the camera pleading for his family's return, he wasn't overwhelmed by guilt. He was performing to regain narrative control. If the world believed him, the illusion could still survive. That's why his tone was so flat. His body language so rehearsed. He was still managing perception. Chris Coleman did the same thing. He called his supervisor, weeping, saying, "They got them. They got my family." The words were scripted. He even drove past his own crime scene, feigning shock for witnesses. He wanted to see his performance from the outside to make sure it looked convincing. That's the paradox of control. The need to manage appearances never stops, even when the truth is already known. Another layer of this pathology is emotional compartmentalization. After the murders, both men were able to function, to talk, drive, eat, and even sleep, because in their minds, they had redefined the event. They weren't murderers. They were problem solvers. Watts later told investigators that he believed ending it was the only way to fix the situation. Coleman said he didn't remember what happened, as if removing memory erased accountability. Each created a mental distance between the act and the self, the ultimate form of psychological control. This ability to emotionally detach from one's own crimes is a hallmark of high-functioning psychopathology. It's not madness, it's calculation. They didn't lose control, they asserted it. In the most perverse way possible. Control also played a role in how they chose to end their families' lives. Chris Watts' act was intimate strangulation, suffocation, a physical assertion of power. He killed by hand, not from distance. To psychologists, that suggests a personal, emotional need to dominate completely, to silence, to erase, to possess. Chris Coleman used a ligature, strangling his wife and children as they slept. It was methodical, cold, and detached, not emotional rage, but strategic elimination. Different methods, same purpose, to reassert total control over a world that no longer obeyed them. In the end, what links them isn't just murder, it's their relationship with power. They believed they could orchestrate every outcome, shape every perception, rewrite every story. But control built on lies is always temporary, and when truth arrived, through investigation, through forensic evidence, through the voices of those who refused to stay silent, both men discovered the same reality. You can't control truth. You can only delay it. Their need for control led them to erase their families. But in doing so, they lost the only thing that made them appear powerful, the image of the devoted husband, the perfect father, the man who had it all. In trying to preserve that illusion, they destroyed everything real. When the facade finally cracks, it rarely happens in silence. For both Chris Watts and Chris Coleman, the collapse came not as a sudden moment of guilt, but as the slow death of a lie that could no longer breathe. It began with confidence. Both men believed they could outsmart investigators, that they could perform their innocence so well that truth would dissolve under charm and composure. But investigators study behavior, and their behavior spoke louder than words. Chris Watts, the quiet collapse. In August 2018, just hours after Shanann and her 2 daughters disappeared, Chris Watts stood on his porch giving interviews. He swayed side to side, crossed his arms, blinked too often. He spoke softly, almost rehearsed. "I just want them back. I just want them safe." But there was something missing. Urgency, emotion, authenticity. Even the reporters could feel it. The next day, police brought him in for questioning. They already had inconsistencies, GPS data from his truck, phone records, surveillance footage. But Watts held the same calm demeanor. He smiled, joked lightly, even asked if he could text his girlfriend during breaks. Forensic psychologists, observing the footage, later noted the same pattern: emotional detachment and cognitive distancing. He wasn't nervous because, in his mind, this was still a performance. He believed he could manage perception like he always had, by appearing composed. Then came the polygraph. He agreed to it confidently, a mistake that would end his illusion. When the machine traced his physiological responses, the deception lines spiked immediately. And as the examiner leaned forward and said softly, "You did not pass this test," the mask began to crumble. Still, he resisted. He asked, "Can I talk to my dad?" And only when his father entered the room did he finally start to break. But even then, his confession came wrapped in denial. "She hurt the kids, so I hurt her." It was a lie inside a truth. A half-confession meant to preserve the last shred of control over the story. Investigators saw through it. They pressed, calmly but relentlessly. Piece by piece, they dismantled his narrative truck, GPS data showing where he dumped the bodies, phone records proving he was awake and active that morning, coworkers confirming his unusual behavior. Eventually, the truth stood bare. Watts had killed Shanann in their bedroom, then smothered his daughters before hiding them in oil tanks at his worksite. The most striking part wasn't his confession, it was his composure. When he finally admitted the murders, his voice remained level. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He simply explained. To psychologists, that tone reflects cognitive dissociation, an emotional disconnect so complete that the words become mechanical. It wasn't guilt speaking, it was exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who could no longer maintain the illusion. Chris Coleman, the arrogant unraveling. Chris Coleman's collapse came differently, louder, more defiant, and more manipulative. In May 2009, when his wife and 2 sons were found strangled in their home, he arrived at the crime scene, crying and shaking. He told police about the threat letters he had been receiving, letters he had written himself. He said he feared someone had targeted his family because of his job. At first, detectives played along, letting him explain the story. They knew, even in that moment, that his timeline didn't add up. His cell phone data showed he left home far later than he claimed. Neighbors hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious, and the supposed killer had left no sign of forced entry. Still, Coleman stuck to his story. He even offered to take a polygraph, which he failed almost immediately. But unlike Watts, he didn't break. He argued, deflected, and grew angry. He insisted the test was wrong, that investigators were trying to frame him. That response, hostility mixed with indignation, is classic narcissistic injury behavior. When confronted with undeniable truth, narcissists often lash out rather than admit fault. As evidence piled up, the emails traced to his laptop, the mistress's testimony, the timeline gaps, Coleman didn't confess. He couldn't. His ego couldn't survive that humiliation. Instead, his demeanor hardened. He spoke less about grief and more about fairness. He shifted from pretending to be a victim of tragedy to claiming he was the victim of what? Injustice. In the courtroom later, he smiled at supporters, adjusted his suit, and glared at prosecutors. To many observers, it seemed as though he still believed he could charm his way out. Even after conviction, Coleman refused to accept responsibility. He continues to proclaim innocence from prison, another symptom of psychopathic denial, the inability to reconcile reality with self-image. The collapse of the mask. Both collapses, Watts' quiet breakdown and Coleman's loud defiance, reveal two faces of the same pathology. Watts's confession came from a man who realized the performance had failed. Coleman's denial came from a man who refused to accept that it had. Different reactions, same disease, the loss of control. Forensic experts studying both cases note how annihilators experience a brief, distorted sense of peace after their crimes. It's the calm that comes when the fantasy feels complete, the illusion of a fresh start. But when reality intrudes, that calm collapses. They face two unbearable truths. The world no longer believes them. The control they killed to preserve is gone forever. Watts crumbled under the weight of guilt and exposure. Coleman, under the weight of pride and exposure. One internalized the loss, the other externalized it. One admitted, the other denied. Yet both displayed the same emotional core, a hollow absence of empathy. The science of collapse. Neuropsychologists studying family annihilators have observed similar brain patterns during interrogation. When confronted, their prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making, shows heightened stress, but the amygdala, the center for emotion, remains muted. In other words, their mind races to strategize, not to feel. They aren't overwhelmed by remorse. They're overwhelmed by the loss of control. That's why their confessions sound detached, technical, precise, even rehearsed. They speak as if describing someone else's story. For Watts, this detachment gave investigators the first true insight into his mind, a man whose sense of self dissolved once the illusion broke. For Coleman, the refusal to admit anything showed something darker, the complete preservation of ego, even after destruction. The moment of collapse. Every killer has a moment when the reality of their actions finally catches up. For Watts, it came later, in prison, during letters where he began describing his daughter's calling to him. That's when remorse began replacing the need for control, when he could no longer lie to himself. For Coleman, that moment never came. Even after years behind bars, he continues to describe himself as misunderstood. He blames investigators, the media, anyone but himself. It's a haunting divide. One man emotionally disintegrates, the other fortifies his delusion. But both paths lead to the same emptiness. Because when the mask breaks and there's nothing real beneath it, what remains is silence, the silence of men who killed everything that once reflected who they wanted to be. When the trials ended, the cameras dimmed, and the headlines began to fade. Both men were left with the same thing, a concrete cell, and a lifetime to face the echo of what they'd done. Yet what happened next reveals more about their psychology than anything that came before. Two prisons, two men, two entirely different realities. Chris Watts, the man who finally felt after sentencing. Chris Watts was moved into protective custody at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Authorities feared other inmates would target him because of the nature of his crimes, the murder of his pregnant wife and two young daughters. Inside that isolation, the image he built for years finally had no audience left. Letters began arriving from strangers, some angry, some strangely sympathetic. True crime followers wanted explanations, redemption stories, even spiritual confessions. And for the first time, Chris Watts started talking. In his letters, he spoke about reading the Bible daily, about guilt that wakes him up every night, about seeing his daughters in dreams. He said he feels their presence and that God has forgiven him. But psychologists who have reviewed those writings see something more complicated. They see a man still shaping his narrative, still performing, but now for himself. Remorse and self-pity often intertwine in confined narcissists. Watts isn't seeking forgiveness from his victims. He's seeking a reason to survive his own emptiness. By turning to religion, he found a new mask, one that makes him the repentant sinner instead of the selfish killer. Guards describe him as polite, quiet, obedient, a model inmate. He works small jobs, keeps to himself, avoids television coverage. But that composure, once again, may be less about peace and more about control. Even behind bars, he is managing perception, this time, the perception of Chris Watts, born again. When asked about Shanann, he speaks softly, sometimes referring to her as my beautiful wife. When asked why, he answers, I wasn't thinking right. I felt trapped. It's always about feelings, never accountability. That subtle shift from action to emotion shows that Watts's mind still avoids true ownership. His life is now routine meals, prayers, letters. He told one correspondent that prison gave him clarity, that freedom would have destroyed him completely. For psychologists, that statement carries truth. Isolation gave him what he always avoided, self-reflection. Whether that reflection is genuine or another layer of fantasy is the question that will define his remaining years. Chris Coleman, the man who still denies. If Watts hides behind remorse, Coleman hides behind righteousness. Sentenced to life without parole, he was transferred to Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, a maximum security prison built for men who refuse to break. And Chris Coleman never broke. He maintains his innocence to this day. He claims the police fabricated evidence that the emails were hacked, that he was framed because of his faith. Every interview, every letter repeats the same message. He is the victim, not the perpetrator. Prison staff describe him as controlling, manipulative, and distant. He participates in church programs, sometimes preaching about false accusations. He rarely mentions his wife or sons by name. He speaks instead about persecution and the burden of being misunderstood. To psychologists, this behavior reflects narcissistic preservation. Coleman cannot survive the idea of being ordinary, let alone guilty. He replaces remorse with martyrdom, recasting himself as a man wronged by an unjust world. Inmate counselors say he is articulate and confident during group sessions, but only when the topic is himself. When discussions turn to empathy or victim impact, he withdraws. That emotional void, the refusal to recognize others' pain, is the hallmark of his pathology. Over a decade later, nothing has changed. He continues to file appeals, often citing divine guidance. He has written letters blaming law enforcement, the media, even his own mistress. In each, he constructs the same narrative: I'm still the good man they destroyed. Inside Menard, Coleman keeps his hair trimmed, his uniform pressed. He carries himself like he's still guarding a church, still performing authority. For him, the prison isn't punishment, it's a stage. And every denial is another rehearsal of the role he refuses to abandon. Remorse versus denial. Side by side, these two lives show the dual faces of conscience. Watts, the quiet, remorseful confessor, uses repentance as a way to regain control. Coleman, the defiant denier, uses innocence as a shield against loss of identity. Both claim transformation. Both live in cages built by their own need for control. Forensic psychologists see in Watts a form of adaptive guilt. a guilt that focuses on the self rather than the victims. It allows him to feel forgiven without confronting the destruction he caused. It's guilt as comfort. Coleman, by contrast, demonstrates fixed narcissistic denial, a mental wall that blocks all accountability. It allows him to survive emotionally, but only by rejecting reality. When researchers map these behaviors on post-crime adjustment charts, both men fall into the same quadrant: high cognitive function, low empathy. They can analyze, explain, even discuss their crimes rationally, but they cannot truly feel them. Two prisons within. Both men serve life sentences, but their true prisons are internal. Chris Watts lives inside guilt, a self he now fears but cannot escape. His punishment is memory. Chris Coleman lives inside denial, a self he refuses to question. His punishment is delusion. One wakes each morning, replaying what he did. The other wakes each morning, pretending it never happened. Different strategies, same result lifetimes, defined by the same absence: empathy. Because without empathy, remorse becomes theater, and denial becomes religion. The mirror they share. Visitors who have spoken with both men describe a strange calm, even warmth. They are polite, soft-spoken, articulate. That composure unsettles people. It reminds us that evil doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like control. And maybe that's the final irony. Even in chains, they are still performing control, still trying to manage how the world sees them. For Chris Watts, it's through humility. For Chris Coleman, it's through defiance. Each still clings to the mask that led them here. Because for both, the performance never truly ends. The audience just changed. When investigators close a case, the public often asks why. Why would a father kill his wife and children? Why would a man destroy everything he built? The question sounds moral, but psychologists know it's mechanical, a system of thought that repeats itself in men like Chris Watts and Chris Coleman. There is a blueprint. It's not written in blood or fate, but in personality, pressure, and perception. 1. The fragile self. At the core of both men lies a fragile self, a hollow identity held together by external validation. Watts built his around approval. He wanted to be liked, seen as calm and dependable. Coleman built his around admiration. He wanted to be respected, seen as strong and righteous. Different expressions, same weakness. They didn't know who they were without reflection from others. When life stopped feeding that reflection, when love turned to responsibility, when attention shifted, when flaws were noticed, their self-image began to collapse. Psychologists call this narcissistic collapse, a psychological implosion that replaces insecurity with desperation. The fragile self cannot absorb failure. It must erase it. 2. The fantasy of control. Both men substituted control for love. Watts imagined a new life, smaller, freer, without judgment. Coleman imagined a life purified of conflict, a new relationship untainted by guilt. Neither wanted to change themselves, they wanted to change reality. Fantasy became planning. Planning became obsession. Obsession became action. In every stage, control replaced conscience. Clinical studies of family annihilators show the same neurological pattern: elevated prefrontal activity, logic, planning, and suppressed limbic activity, emotion, empathy. In simple terms, they thought but did not feel. Their crimes were cognitive decisions, not emotional outbursts. 3. The loss of empathy. Empathy keeps imagination human. Without it, fantasy becomes execution. Chris Watts could stand over his daughter's beds and tell himself it was mercy. Chris Coleman could strangle his children in sleep and tell himself it was necessity. To them, pain was abstract, something happening to someone else. In interviews, psychologists call this objectification of the family. The victims stop being individuals and become symbols of stress, of judgment, of failure. When that shift happens, empathy shuts down completely. The image addiction. Both men were addicts, not to substances, but to image. Their entire lives were built around being seen. Social media, church stages, family photos. Every smile was a performance. Every gesture a form of control. Watts used humility as disguise. Coleman used confidence. But both manipulated visibility. When that visibility turned against them, when the image cracked, they experienced something close to withdrawal, the agony of exposure. And like any addict, they sought relief in destruction. 5. The moral distortion. Religion shaped both men differently, but with the same outcome. Coleman wore faith like armor. Watts found it later as redemption. But neither used it as conscience. In Coleman's case, religion reinforced superiority, the belief that he was chosen, protected, special. In Watts's case, religion became a refuge after collapse, proof that even monsters can be forgiven. In psychology, this is moral disengagement. It allows offenders to twist belief systems into justification. They redefine sin as mistake and consequence as persecution. 6. The silencing of women. Another parallel sits quietly beneath both stories. The silencing of women. Shanann Watts and Sherry Coleman were vocal, assertive, and emotionally expressive. They confronted lies, demanded honesty, expected partnership. Their strength threatened the fragile egos of their husbands. Instead of meeting that strength with honesty, both men responded with annihilation. To them, removing their wives meant removing the voice that exposed their weakness. It was not love turned to hate. It was fear turned to erasure. 7. The aftermath of ego. In most homicides, remorse appears quickly. In family annihilation, it often never does. Because the ego that committed the act cannot coexist with the reality of it. The killer must either die physically or psychologically, or rebuild the ego through new illusions. Religion, denial, victimhood. Watts chose rebirth. Coleman chose denial. Both choices protect the ego from extinction. 8. What they taught us. These two cases reveal more than individual pathology. They expose cultural patterns. The pressure on men to appear perfect instead of honest. The glorification of control over vulnerability. The belief that image defines worth. When society praises appearances without valuing emotional truth, fragile personalities multiply. And fragile personalities break, sometimes violently. True prevention doesn't begin with punishment. It begins with awareness. It means teaching boys that failure is survivable, that love isn't ownership, that strength without empathy isn't strength at all. Because Chris Watts and Chris Coleman were not born killers. They were shaped by silence, the silence of shame, of expectation, of fear of imperfection. And in that silence, darkness grew. 9. The blueprint summed up. Every family annihilator walks the same mental corridor. Fragile self, times fantasy of control, times loss of empathy, times justification, times destruction. It's not rage, it's ego collapse disguised as logic. Watts and Coleman are case studies of the same disease: narcissism without empathy, intellect without morality, control without soul. And that is the blueprint. It's not just theirs, it's the one society still builds every time it rewards the mask more than the man beneath it. When the cameras fade and the world moves on, stories like these leave a quiet residue, questions that linger in the mind long after the verdict is read. Why did they do it? Could anyone have stopped them? And how does a man who once kissed his children goodnight become the monster who ends their lives? The truth is that evil rarely enters loudly. It begins as silence, small moments of avoidance, of pride, of self-deception. It grows quietly, hidden behind smiles and rehearsed words, until one day, the mask no longer fits. Chris Watts and Chris Coleman remind us that monsters aren't born in darkness. They build it brick by brick through lies, denial, and the hunger to be seen as perfect. Their crimes didn't start with murder. They started with the decision to stop being honest, the mirror we refuse to face. Society loves to separate itself from men like them. We call them psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissists, anything that makes them different from us. But beneath the labels lies something universal: the fear of being ordinary. Watts and Coleman lived their lives chasing approval. And that same impulse, the need to be liked, admired, validated, lives quietly in everyone. In them, it simply grew unchecked. They couldn't stand imperfection, and they couldn't accept loss. So they turned life itself into a stage they could control. In many ways, their crimes are extreme reflections of a culture that teaches us to perform instead of feel, to project happiness instead of confront pain, to hide struggle behind curated images of success. Theirs are the darkest possible outcomes of that illusion. The price of perfection. Perfection is a dangerous addiction. It whispers that peace comes from approval, that love is measured by appearance, that control means safety. But real strength begins where control ends, in vulnerability, in honesty, in the courage to be seen as imperfect. Both men killed because they couldn't bear to look weak. But weakness wasn't their enemy. Denial was. If either had faced the mirror and admitted fear, resentment, or failure, their families might still be alive. It wasn't hate that destroyed them. It was pride. The forgotten voices. Amid the analysis and the psychology, it's easy to forget the true story, the lives erased by two fragile egos. Shanann Watts, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico, who never took his first breath. Sherry Coleman, Garrett and Gavin, two little boys who loved their father completely. They were not symbols of stress or shame. They were human beings, kind, hopeful, innocent. They deserved to live in a world where truth mattered more than pride. Their voices were silenced, but their stories still speak, reminders that beneath the headlines are real families, real futures, real light, lost to darkness. The lesson that remains. The story of Chris Watts and Chris Coleman teaches us that the greatest threat doesn't come from monsters hiding in shadows. It comes from the faces that smile in daylight, hiding the storm inside. We cannot always prevent evil, but we can understand it. We can see the warning signs, the isolation, the control, the obsession with image, and intervene before silence becomes tragedy. Prevention begins with conversation, with asking questions that feel uncomfortable, with encouraging honesty instead of appearance. Because truth, no matter how painful, saves lives. Lies, no matter how perfect, destroy them. The dark truth about Chris Watts and Chris Coleman is that they weren't seeking freedom. They were seeking validation, and when the world stopped giving it, they erased the witnesses. They didn't kill to escape their families. They killed to escape themselves. In their desperation for control, they lost the one thing that made them human: empathy. And in losing empathy, they became what they feared most: powerless. Their stories are not just cautionary tales of murder. They're warnings about what happens when ego becomes identity and appearance becomes God. Because when a person builds their worth on the eyes of others, they become trapped forever, performing for an audience that will never truly see them. And eventually, the performance ends. Final reflection. Today, both men wake up in the same silence they once feared. No cameras, no illusion, just four walls and the memories of what they destroyed. And maybe somewhere inside that silence, there's a truth even they can no longer control: that the image they killed for was never real. If this story made you stop and think, make sure to subscribe to Dark Truths, True Crime Stories. Every week, we explore the hidden psychology behind real crimes, stories that reveal not just what happened, but why. Like this video if you believe truth deserves to be told. Comment your thoughts below. What do you think truly drives men like Chris Watts and Chris Coleman? Is it control, fear, pride, or something even darker? Share this documentary to help others see the warning signs before it's too late. Your support helps this channel grow, reach more viewers, and keep telling the stories that matter. Because understanding darkness is the only way to protect the light.